Wouldn't it be nice if you could just watch your favorite shows or listen to your favorite podcast and that would be enough to learn another language? Well, you can do that, but most people are doing listening the wrong way. Hi, I'm Nick. I speak 4 languages and I'm currently working on a language learning app. The main problem people have with listening is the exact same problem they have with reading. They focus way too much on what they don't understand. They hear a word they don't know, and instead of continuing to listen, they stop, they try to translate it, they try to figure it out, and they spend way too much time doing that instead of actually listening. And that completely removes one of the biggest benefits of listening in the first place. Listening is supposed to be enjoyable. It's supposed to feel natural. It's supposed to feel like you're just interacting with language the same way anyone else would. But the moment you start pausing all the time and looking things up, you lose that. It becomes less enjoyable and it becomes less effective. It starts feeling like it would if you were studying using a grammar book or studying in school, because you're no longer getting that continuous exposure to the language through methods that you find enjoyable. You're interrupting it constantly, and that's not how you get better at listening or at the language. So what should you be doing instead? First of all, you need a base. This is something I talk about all the time. You need around 200 general words and then about 50 words that are specific to something you're interested in. Because if you don't have that, then listening is just going to be noise. But once you have that base, you can actually start understanding things in context. And that's when listening becomes useful. At that point, your goal is not to understand everything. Your goal is to understand enough. You want to stay in that range where you understand most of what's being said, but not everything, because that's where learning happens. And more importantly, that's where it stays enjoyable. If you're able to find a balance, which I would say is that you're able to understand about 80 to 95% of what you're hearing, then you're no longer using listening as a study tool. You're using it as something you enjoy, and the learning happens as a side effect. Now, another mistake people make is that they try to listen to everything. They jump from topic to topic, from show to show, from podcast to podcast, and that doesn't work very well. At least if you're doing things correctly and you have a very limited base, then that means that you can start listening early, but you're limited to what you are able to listen to, because those 50 specific words that you learn are tied to a certain context. So if you suddenly switch to something completely different, you're going to lose most of your understanding unless you spend about 4 times as long just to reach the vocabulary necessary to be able to switch. Instead, you want to stay within your niche for a while, and if you built a base around something like Pokemon, then you stick with that. You watch content related to that, you play the games, you interact with content as much as possible. Now, there's not much listening with the games, but you have the series, and that's available for free on YouTube, for instance. Now, that gives you repeated exposure to the same types of words, and that repetition is actually what makes things stick. Once you've done that for a while, you will have 2 options. You can either expand by building another base in a different area, which gives you more opportunities for comprehensible input, or you can rely on the fact that you've already picked up general vocabulary to start branching out slowly. But either way, you don't just jump into something completely unfamiliar and expect for it to work. Now, when you do start expanding, you're going to run into something else. Things are going to get harder, and that's normal. You can handle that in 2 ways. You can either go deeper into the same niche and increase the complexity, or you can switch to a new niche, but keep the content simpler. I would say keep the same complexity probably. You should not be doing both at the same time, because that's when it becomes too overwhelming. And if it does become too difficult, there's nothing wrong with changing your approach. Let's say that you'd finished watching 1 season of Pokemon, and you decided that you wanted to switch to another show. That became too difficult. Then there's nothing wrong with pausing that show that you just switched to and going back to something familiar, easier, within the same context. As long as you stay within a context that you already understand, you'll still be progressing. But if you do decide to stick with something, it usually gets easier after I'd say about 20 hours. You get used to how people speak, you get used to the rhythm, and what initially felt impossible starts becoming manageable. Now, let's talk about the opposite problem. Content that's too easy. A lot of people think that they should start with content made for kids, and yet that will make it easier to understand, but it also makes it much harder to stay consistent because it's just not that engaging. It's not something that you enjoy. Pokemon was made for kids, but a lot of people have nostalgia for that, and so in some ways it still works. But in other cases, it becomes boring, and if you're not actually interested in what you're watching or listening to, then you're not going to stick with it. And if you don't stick with it, you don't get the repetition that you need. So the content has to be interesting to you. That's a non-negotiable. You're not doing this just to understand more. You're doing this to enjoy the process while you're learning. If you do this right, this is going to lead to you learning a lot without it feeling like you're studying. But once you start getting comfortable, then there's another problem. You stop feeling like you're progressing. When you finish a show or you get used to a certain type of content, it stops feeling challenging. And at that point, you have to make a decision. Either you increase the complexity or you increase the speed. Increasing the complexity means finding something slightly more difficult. Let's say, for instance, that you really liked listening to fantasy audiobooks. Then you finish, for instance, Percy Jackson, and then you move on to something that's more challenging. If you want to increase the speed, that means that you consume more in the same amount of time. You can speed up videos, you can speed up podcasts, and what that does is that it gives you more exposure in that same time frame. That's something that you can do if you don't want to keep switching series too frequently. For instance, if you wanted to watch more than one season of Pokemon, the first season you might watch at normal speed, and then the next 1.5. You hear more words, you get more repetitions, and that helps you keep progressing. For that to work, you're going to need a decent base. But once you have that, it becomes one of the most effective ways to improve without having to look for new content. Now, you might run into this problem, which is one that I've had myself, because there were times where I tried to watch shows that I was already familiar with. I think the best example with this was Scrubs, and that's a show that I know that I like, but it's not made for beginners. It's not made for someone that doesn't have the vocabulary, and I didn't have the base to be able to follow it. Even though I knew what was happening, I couldn't pick out the words, and that was really demotivating. So I had two options. I could either step back and watch something easier, or just push through. I had already switched once, and I knew that that worked. I did that once I started How I Met Your Mother, and then moved back to Pokemon. Both shows that I'd already watched, but I felt like I was ready with French to do this with Scrubs. And so I decided to just push through. And I started noticing after probably 20 episodes, which is a lot, that something that felt impossible had suddenly become a lot easier. And that's really what listening comes down to. You don't learn by understanding everything. You learn by staying in that space where you understand enough, and then letting repetition do the rest. So if you feel like your listening isn't improving, it's probably not because you're bad at it. It's probably because you're approaching it the wrong way. Stop focusing on every word you don't understand, and start focusing on the overall meaning. Stay within a context that you understand, and make sure it's something that you actually enjoy. If you need help getting that base of 200 words and then 50 extra words, then consider having a go at my app, which you can find a link below. But once you get to the point where you are ready to watch, make sure to give it enough time for repetition to do its job. That's how listening actually works.